concerns about the impact on the U.S. education system by China. The report is a result of an 8-month investigation that details our concerns focused on the China Confucius Institutes. Based on our findings, we were here to focus on a couple of issues: transparency and reciprocity. Transparency in how American colleges and universities and K-12 institutions manage Confucius Institutes, which are controlled, funded, and mostly staffed by the Chinese government, and aim to promote Chinese language and culture and Chinese interests on U.S. campuses. Lack of reciprocity in how China does not permit U.S. State Department programming in China. We'll hear more about that today. Our report details how China, known for its one-sided dealings in trade sometimes, uses similar tactics in its unfair treatment of U.S. schools and the State Department in their efforts in China. Let me be clear, I support cultural exchange. I support cultural exchanges with China and other international exchanges more broadly. I'm for engagement, but there must be reciprocity and there must be appropriate engagement without the Chinese government determining what is said and done on U.S. campuses. And the law must be followed. This is why transparency is so important. U.S. officials have expressed concerns about China's influence through its Confucius Institutes. Recently, FBI's Assistant Director for Counterintelligence testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee that Confucius Institutes are, and I quote, not strictly a cultural institute, and that they're ultimately beholden to the Chinese government, end quote. And the State Department has labeled Confucius Institutes, quote, China's most prominent soft power platform. Higher education groups have also expressed concern. The American Council of Education, the National Association of Scholars, the American Association of University Professors have all recommended that U.S. schools fundamentally change how they manage Confucius Institutes or consider discontinuing them altogether. We know that Confucius Institutes exist as just one part of China's broader long-term strategy, but China has invested significantly in them, giving more than $158 million to U.S. schools since 2006. That's over 12 years, not 1 year, incidentally, as I said yesterday. China has also opened more than 500 Confucius classrooms at U.S. K-12 schools. Expanding the Confucius classroom program is a priority for them. A document obtained by the subcommittee details a plan to expand Confucius classrooms by seeking, and I quote, top-down policy support from the state government, legislative and educational institutions with a particular emphasis on access to the support from school, district superintendents, and principals. End quote. Over the last 8 months, we interviewed U.S. school officials, teachers, and Confucius Institute instructors. We also reviewed tens of thousands of pages of contracts, emails, financial records, and other internal documents obtained from more than 100 U.S. schools with either active or closed Confucius Institutes. Since our investigation started, more than 10 U.S. schools announced they would be discontinuing their Confucius Institutes. We found that the Chinese funding for Confucius Institutes comes with strings attached, strings that can compromise academic freedom. The Chinese government vets and approves all Chinese directors and teachers, events, research proposals, and speakers at U.S. Confucius Institutes. Chinese teachers at U.S. Confucius Institutes sign contracts with the Chinese government, pledging that they will follow Chinese law and, quote, conscientiously safeguard China's national interests, end quote. Some schools contractually agree that both Chinese and U.S. laws will apply to the Confucius Institutes on U.S. school campuses. Think about that for a second. These are American universities agreeing to comply with Chinese law on their own campuses. This application of Chinese law at U.S. schools results in China's exporting censorship of political debate and prevent discussion of some politically sensitive topics. As such, numerous U.S. school officials told the subcommittee that Confucius Institutes were not the place to discuss topics like the independence of Taiwan or the Tiananmen Square massacre. Simply put, as one U.S. school administrator told us, quote, you know what you're getting when something is funded by the Chinese government, end quote. Investigators from the General Accountability Office also spoke with U.S. school officials who acknowledged that hosting a Confucius Institute could limit events or activities critical of China, and not just at the Confucius Institute, but also elsewhere on campus. We'll hear from Mr. Baer about that today. In response to the growing popularity of Confucius Institutes, the U.S. State Department initiated its own public policy program in China. The Chinese government effectively shut it down. Since 2010, the State Department has provided $5.1 million in grant funding for 29 American cultural centers or ACCs, in China. Through the program, a U.S. school would partner with a Chinese school to set up a cultural center which would enable Chinese students to better understand U.S. culture. The Chinese government stifled the program from the start. 7 of the 29 ACCs never even opened. The ACCs that did open found they needed permission from their Chinese partner schools, sometimes including the local Chinese Communist Party officials, to even hold events. Eventually, the State Department stopped funding the program altogether. Again, we'll hear about that program today. While the State Department is mostly known for its overseas diplomacy efforts, it also has oversight responsibilities right here in the United States. The State Department conducts field site reviews to ensure that foreign nationals who come to the United States on exchange visitor program visas are here for their stated reason. While there are roughly 100 Confucius Institutes, again at colleges and universities in the United States, the State Department has conducted field site reviews at only 2. And the State Department found serious problems at both of those schools. State revoked more than 30 visas for Chinese exchange visitors at Confucius Institutes who were only supposed to be working at the university that sponsored their visa, but were actually teaching at Confucius classrooms at local K-12 schools. State discovered evidence of, quote, fraudulent paperwork and coaching, end quote, that was, quote, a deliberate attempt to deceive investigators. Moreover, State told us that it does not collect visa information specifically related to Confucius Institute, so we don't know how many Confucius Institute teachers there are or where they are. Our investigation also identified failures at the Department of Education that have contributed to a lack of transparency and oversight of schools that take money from foreign governments. Under law, if a U.S. school receives more than $250,000 from a single foreign source in 1 year, it is required to report that data to the Department of Education, which in turn publishes it. Our investigation found that nearly 70% of the schools that should have reported receiving funds for a Confucius Institute from China did not. When a school fails to report a foreign gift, the Department of Justice can force a school to comply, but only at the request of the Secretary of Education. The Department of Education has never referred this case, these types of cases, to the Department of Justice, not once. The Department of Education has not issued any guidance since October 2004, over 14 years ago, the same year that China opened its first Confucius Institute. It's time for new guidance. Our investigation found that schools in the United States, from kindergarten to college, have provided a level of access to the Chinese government that the Chinese government refuses to provide to the United States. Again, this brings us back to our 2 key points: transparency and reciprocity. Absent full transparency regarding how Confucius Institutes operate and full reciprocity for U.S. cultural outreach efforts on Chinese campuses, Confucius Institutes should not continue in the United States, in my view. With that, I turn to Senator Carper for his opening statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your attention to this issue. I want to thank our staffs, both the minority side and the majority side, for the bipartisan work that went into this hearing. I'm going to go off script here just for a minute, if I could, and put this hearing in context. Earlier in my life, I was a naval flight officer. Served 3 tours in Southeast Asia. There are the names of 50,000 men, some women, on a big wall, a granite wall, just near the Lincoln Memorial that I run by every now and then. And when I run by it, I brush my fingers across the names of the people I serve with. I had the privilege in 1991 of leading a congressional delegation to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos to find out what happened to thousands of MIAs and to try to see if there might be a way to get onto a roadmap to normalize relations with between the U.S. and the Vietnamese at the behest of President George Herbert Walker Bush's administration. And we had an incredible CODEL and had a very emotional meeting with a brand new leader of Vietnam. And it led to put us on the roadmap to normalize relations. John Kerry, our colleagues John Kerry and John McCain, worked it hard in the Senate. Our delegation worked it hard in the House. One of the members of my delegation actually became our first U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, united Vietnam in decades. And when it was all over, fast forward 3 years, almost 3 years ago in this April, President Obama invited John Kerry, John McCain, myself, to go back with him to Vietnam, to reaffirm our relations, our improving relations, and to expand our trade relations with him, including our defense and military cooperation with Vietnam, the country that killed 50,000 of our men and women, and as attested to by this wall I run alongside every now and then. And one of the things we learned from our visit there was that U.S. ambassador, told us, he said, this was 3 years ago, he said, we have 2 popular opinion polls that were taken of the Vietnamese people 3 years ago. He said one of them, taken by a group other than the U.S., found that 95% of the Vietnamese have a positive opinion toward the United States, higher than any other nation, 95%. We commissioned our own survey and found that 90% of Vietnamese people had a positive opinion of us. So like, I describe it as they like us more than we like us. Think about that. And the reason why I say that, and I don't know if my colleagues went to Munich during our last recess, about 15 of our colleagues went to Munich for a big securities meeting and kind of reaffirm our allegiance to our European allies and NATO, an important meeting. And, but it was hosted in Munich. And in World War II, we lost hundreds of thousands of troops because of that country and their leaders. And today they're one of our best allies. The same situation with Japan. So I think it's important to remember that the folks that might be a dread enemy at one point in time in our history can turn around and be our best friends and our best allies. And it's important that we try to make sure that our relationship with China turns out good for them and good for us. And I think the point that our chairman makes is reciprocity. That's probably, for me, that's maybe the most important element to take away from this hearing. The idea that they're trying to share with us their culture, their language, I think that's great. This is a huge country. But the idea they should be reciprocating and welcoming our opportunities to do the same thing. And now I'm back on script. Ready? This will only take about an hour. No, it won't. Ni hao. All of the words I know, the words that I know in Mandarin, I know ni hao, I know shesha, thank you, and I know how to say Happy New Year, dong shi sai fai. That's pretty much it. So if I were just speaking in Chinese, it would be a short statement. Unfortunately for you, it's not that short. But more than 2 years ago now, the Russian government launched an unprecedented attack on our country. Using disinformation and stolen emails, they took advantage of America's growing use of social media in an attempt to stir up conflict and influence the 2016 election by boosting the campaign of one candidate while denigrating the campaign and the candidacy of another. Today's reports are already emerging that disinformation campaigns targeting a number of Democrats seeking to run against President Trump have already begun. And given what our country's been through in recent years and what we're preparing to grapple with in 2020, it's important that we be vigilant in combating foreign efforts to influence American public opinion, regardless of where they originate. Today, we'll be examining the quiet efforts by the Chinese government to improve its image in Americans' minds through its Confucius Institute. China opened its first Confucius Institute outside of Asia, I think in the U.S., about 15 years ago. And they did it at the University of Maryland. The Chinese have this fixation with terrapins, so they picked Maryland, I'm told, for that reason. It has since opened roughly 100 of its 500 institutes, I guess, throughout the country. In this country, there's about 100 of them. In addition, half of the 1,000 Confucius classrooms that it runs through its Confucius Institutes are in our primary and our secondary schools. Activity at the individual Confucius Institutes that our staffs visited and examined varied quite a bit. At one school, I'm told the Chinese visitors in the Confucius Institutes perform research and work as teaching assistants in foreign credit Mandarin classes, which we could probably all benefit from. At other schools, the Chinese visitors taught more informal, non-credit classes to both college students and members of the community. These classes focused on everything from Mandarin for business travelers to topics like Chinese cooking, which we enjoy, and Chinese art, which a lot of us enjoy. In a handful of schools, Confucius Institute staff focused almost exclusively on placing visiting language teachers in K-12 schools in the area. At all the schools, Confucius Institute staff seemed to focus a significant amount of time on events like Chinese New Year parties, and I've been to a few of those, and they're fun. At best, we can determine these institutes spread around our country do not appear to be overt efforts by the Chinese Communist Party to spread pro-China or anti-American propaganda. There's also no evidence we've uncovered that suggests that they're a center for some kind of Chinese espionage efforts or any other illegal activities. That said, we nonetheless need to be mindful of where the story told by these Confucius Institutes is coming from. FBI Director Wray and others have expressed concerns about the presence of Confucius Institutes in our schools because they were conceived by and are funded by Chinese government that has a much different worldwide view than ours. The $158 million that China spent on Confucius Institutes in the U.S. comes from a government that routinely stifles free speech, stifles debate, stifles dissent in its own country. It's a government that monitors and jails religious and ethnic minorities and has a violent history of oppression. It's also a government that routinely targets us through hacking and industrial espionage and threatens Taiwan and our other close allies in Asia militarily. And I would add, it's a country that basically has tried to blockade, keep other ships, including U.S. naval vessels, out of the South China Sea, and places where I used to operate and fly mini missions during the Vietnam War on surface surveillance of that part of the world. Participants at Confucius Institute-sponsored activities won't get the full story on these issues, and that's because under the contracts that U.S. schools have signed with the Chinese government, Chinese officials can veto programming they don't like. And the staff sent from China to run the institutes are prohibited under their individual contracts from doing anything, quote, detrimental to national interest, close quote. Well, despite my concern about the Confucius Institutes and China's goals for them, I welcome, as I may have inferred earlier, I welcome greater opportunities for Americans to learn more about China, visit the country, and speak Mandarin. And I want Chinese citizens to visit here and learn more about us and our language and culture as well. When I was there not long ago, I think it was Aspen Institute to visit, one of the things I said to a bunch of the Chinese that we met with, there's more that unites us and divides us, and let's try to figure out how we can focus more on the former, maybe less on the latter. Data reported by the Department of Education indicate that as many as 400 million people in China are attempting to learn English. And according to a 2018 Pew Research study, more than 90% of European primary and secondary school students are learning a foreign language. At the same time, get this, only 20% of American students are working to learn another language. Not good. We need to do better than that at a time when the world is getting smaller, when our country is growing more diverse, and when so many American jobs are reliant on global trade. It's in our nation's best interest for more Americans to learn foreign language, and that includes Mandarin. And to the extent that there's unmet demand in our country for Chinese language education, we should be filling it rather than allowing the Chinese government to fill in. The report we've released recommends a number of steps that schools with Confucius Institutes can take to change their relationship with the Chinese government and assert the supremacy of free speech, free debate, and academic freedom on their campuses. In closing, we also make recommendations to the U.S. Department of Education and State to ensure that Confucius Institutes are operating within the law. We call on the Chinese to stop blocking our efforts in cultural outreach in their country. As I stated earlier, it's crucial that we continue to be vigilant in combating foreign efforts to influence public opinion in our country. But if we take any other lessons away from today's hearing, I hope it is that in order to preserve our economic competitiveness and protect our national security, we need to make certain that our students are learning about other cultures and studying Mandarin and other key languages too. And with that, I will just say, again, ni hao, and xie xie. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Miss. I'm sorry that it took so long. And I was with Max Baucus. Max Baucus was in an elevator here yesterday in the Capitol, and our immediate past ambassador, former colleague here, and a senator from Montana. And one of the things I mentioned to him briefly is our hearing today, and he said he'd be interested in following up with us, and he could probably give us some good insights. So we look forward to those. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Carper, and thank you, my friend, for partnering on this report, as always, and to your staff. As you probably have noticed, there's not a lot of bipartisanship here on Capitol Hill. We keep this committee as nonpartisan as possible, and as a result, we've done some pretty good work that's resulted in some important legislation. as we did today. So I'd like to now introduce our panel of witnesses for the hearing. Jason Baer is the Acting Director of International Affairs and Trade at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Walter Douglas is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the State Department. Jennifer Galt is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Cultural and Educational Activities at the State Department. And Mick Zais is the Deputy Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. It's the custom of this subcommittee to swear in witnesses, so at this time I'd ask you all to please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give before the subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses all answered in the affirmative, and your written testimony, ladies and gentlemen, will all be considered to be part of the record, so you don't need to give your entire statement. We'd ask you that you try to limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes, and again, we'll have a chance for a real dialogue after your oral testimony. Mr. Baer, why don't we start with you?
Chairman Portman, Ranking Member Carper, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's work on Chinese involvement in U.S. higher education. My testimony summarizes 2 GAO reports, one issued yesterday on Confucius Institutes, and one issued in August 2016 on U.S. universities operating in China. I'll start by discussing our observations on the 96 Confucius Institutes operating on U.S. college campuses. My overall message is that Confucius Institute agreements vary in some key areas, and stakeholders have identified opportunities to improve those agreements. In examining the agreements between U.S. universities and Hanban, an affiliate of the Chinese Ministry of Education, we found that there are a variety of issues that can be addressed. Regarding the applicability of school policies, we found that about 1/3 contained language that applied U.S. school policies to the operation of the Confucius Institutes. Regarding the public availability of the agreements, we found that only approximately half contained language that made the agreement confidential or limited the ability of either party to release the agreement. Regarding funding, we found that Hanban generally provides startup funds, annual funds, teachers and their salaries, and teaching materials, while U.S. schools generally provide in-kind support, such as campus space and staff to help manage the Confucius Institute. Regarding teachers, we found that Confucius Institute teachers from China taught a mix of both credit-bearing and non-credit courses at different schools. However, none of our 10 case study schools used the materials provided by Hanban in their credit-bearing classes. We also gathered suggestions for improving the Confucius Institutes from school officials, researchers, and others. They suggested improvements in 2 main areas. First, they suggested improving the language of the agreements. Specifically, several people suggested removing the confidentiality language from the agreements and making them available online in order to dispel any questions or concerns about what they contained. In addition, some school officials, researchers, and others suggested that agreements should include even stronger language, making it clearer that the U.S. school has ultimate decision-making authority when it came to operating the Confucius Institute. Second, they suggested improvements in the operation of the institutes. For example, some school officials suggested to us that Confucius Institute teachers should not teach credit-bearing courses on campuses, even if they were using the curriculum that had been developed by the U.S. school. In addition, some officials suggested that Confucius Institutes should choose to organize events on topics that are sensitive to China in order to demonstrate that neither the school nor the institute is subject to undue Chinese influence. Moving now to our 2016 report on U.S. universities operating in China. My key message is that U.S. universities do emphasize academic freedom, but they face a variety of challenges. At the time of our review, 12 U.S. universities were operating degree-granting institutions in China. In reviewing their written agreements and other policies, we found that they did include a variety of protections for academic freedom. For example, one university's agreement stated that everyone at the institution in China will have unlimited freedoms of expression and inquiry and would not be restricted in the selection of research or lecture topics. We also interviewed more than 130 faculty and students, who generally reported that academic freedom had not been restricted for them and that they could study and discuss any topic. However, we identified two key challenges to learning at U.S. universities in China. First, fewer than half of the universities that we reviewed had uncensored internet access. Students and faculty told us that having restricted access to the internet limited both their teaching and their research. Second, administrators, faculty, and students representing more than half of the universities gave examples of self-censorship. For example, an administrator at one university suggested that it was advisable, as a guest of China, to refrain from insulting China. Another administrator noted that the university advises teachers to avoid discussing sensitive subjects in their classes. Chairman Portman, Ranking Member Carper, and members of the subcommittee, that concludes my prepared statement. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Douglas.
Chairman Portman, Ranking Member Carper, members of the subcommittee, thank you for your invitation to discuss the State Department's public diplomacy efforts in China. U.S. diplomats carry out a range of public diplomacy activities in China. This includes both policy-related messaging as well as cultural and education exchanges. Our diplomats do this work despite restrictions by Chinese authorities, which I'll describe in more detail later in this statement. Our public diplomacy in China is conducted through our 6 diplomatic posts there, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and 5 consulates spread throughout China. We have a total of about 110 staff, including Chinese-speaking American diplomats and local employees, as well as a budget of $31 million to support public diplomacy functions. By and large, Chinese citizens welcome U.S. public diplomacy, but the Chinese government impedes access to some segments of Chinese society, including in academic settings. To give a recent example, this past November, U.S. Ambassador to China Terry Branstad was scheduled to speak at a Chinese university campus, but the visit was canceled with just 2 days' notice. This is just one of many cases of unexplained and sudden cancellations experienced by U.S. diplomats attempting to visit universities. We have also seen the obstruction of programs related to the U.S. government-funded American Cultural Centers. The American Cultural Center grant program was started in 2010 specifically for China. Until it was discontinued in 2018, the program awarded a total of about $5 million in grants, ranging from $100,000 to $10,000 to $100,000. These grants were given to 29 American universities to establish American Cultural Centers on Chinese university campuses. While the program had many successes in the early years, beginning in 2014, Chinese authorities started unduly restricting the activities of our centers. In 2015 and 2016, severe restrictions came into effect, and some of the centers were forced to close down. Today, there are 3 remaining U.S. universities that are conducting previously funded American Cultural Center-related activities, which they will conclude by the summer of 2019. These restrictions on American cultural centers stand in stark contrast to the ability of Confucius Institutes to operate free from government obstruction in the United States. In 2017, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing decided to discontinue funding for the American Cultural Center program. This decision was solidified in a recommendation by the Department's Office of the Inspector General. Chinese universities or scholars who would like to engage with U.S. diplomats are often prevented from doing so, either by their university's internal foreign affairs officers or by security authorities. When meetings do take place, Chinese authorities require participants to submit detailed reports of their conversations. These intimidation tactics pressure our interlocutors to be cautious. They refuse or limit interaction with U.S. diplomats. As a result, the ability of U.S. diplomats to engage with ordinary Chinese people is stifled. In contrast, we note that Chinese diplomats here in the United States regularly address public audiences free from obstruction by the U.S. government, including on university campuses. U.S. government-funded exchange programs are another way we engage the next generation of China's leaders and opinion makers. For example, the International Visitor Leadership Program brings between 120 and 150 rising leaders each year from across China to the United States for 3-week study tours. However, unlike in other countries, authorities force about 20% of the candidates to withdraw their participation at the last minute. This is yet another avenue through which the Chinese government limits who can have access to information about the United States. The State Department takes notice when incidents like these take place. In just one 16-month period, there are more than 150 instances involving denial of permission to meet an official, cancellation of an event with a partner organization, withdrawal of a Chinese participant from a U.S. government-funded exchange program, or intimidation of a Chinese citizen who had been in contact with the U.S. Embassy or consulate personnel. We continually convey to the Chinese government that we expect reciprocal access for U.S. diplomatic personnel and programs in China. In spite of these restrictions, we work to reach the broader Chinese public through traditional media and social media. In particular, our diplomatic posts in China maintain a robust social media presence, reaching an average of more than 3.5 million Chinese citizens each day. Our social media postings receive thousands of likes, comments, and shares daily, showing the Chinese public's eagerness to engage in discussion about U.S.-related topics. But similar to the restrictions placed on our direct campus engagement, our social media platforms in China experience censorship by the Chinese government several times each week. This censorship stands in stark contrast to the unhindered use of social media enjoyed by the Embassy of China in Washington, D.C., which launched its Facebook page over a year ago. We continually convey to the Chinese government that the United States expects reciprocity in the use of social media. The Department welcomes the subcommittee's inquiry into the questions of reciprocity regarding U.S. and Chinese public diplomacy efforts. As noted in the report, the Department's public diplomacy efforts in China have indeed experienced restrictions. This presents a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. The State Department continues to work towards reaching ordinary Chinese citizens and facilitating dialogue between our peoples and in promoting American values. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering your questions and those of other members of the subcommittee.
Thank you. Ms. Gold.
Chairman Portman, Ranking Member Carper, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My testimony will focus on the State Department's responsibility to regulate and monitor the participation of Chinese nationals in the Exchange Visitor Program. This program makes it possible each year for over 300,000 exchange visitors from nearly 200 countries and territories to travel to the United States to participate in educational and cultural exchanges. As mandated by Congress, the State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs works to advance U.S. foreign policy by building friendly, peaceful relations through exchange programs that strengthen national security, support U.S. international leadership, and provide a broad range of domestic benefits. The Fulbright Program and the International Visitor Leadership Program are the U.S. government's flagship exchange programs funded through annual congressional appropriations. In addition to these, the Bureau oversees fee-funded exchange visitor programs, which are carried out by nearly 1,500 public and private entities that the State Department designates as sponsors. No appropriated funds are spent on these programs. The Office of Private Sector Exchange is sponsored with promulgating, implementing, and enforcing federal regulations that govern all aspects of the Exchange Visitor Program. Entities seeking designation must apply separately for authority to conduct programs in one or more of the 13 private sector categories of exchange. Exchange visitors from China comprise approximately 11% of the more than 300,000 Exchange Visitor Program participants from around the world. Chinese exchange visitors associated with U.S. colleges and universities that host Confucius Institutes are one element of Chinese participation in the Exchange Visitor Program. Confucius Institutes are typically set up as collaborations between a U.S. and a Chinese university. The State Department does not have a role in the creation or funding of Confucius Institutes. Our responsibility begins when a U.S. college or university that is a designated sponsor places an exchange visitor in a role that is related to a Confucius Institute. As part of our routine sponsor monitoring, the Office of Private Sector Exchange learned in 2012 that a number of Chinese exchange visitors participating in the research scholar category were inappropriately placed at K-12 schools as Chinese language teachers. Accordingly, the department issued a guidance directive to potentially affected sponsors, providing procedures for regularizing the program status of exchange visitors who were under the incorrect category. The guidance directive clarified that exchange visitors in one of the university-based academic categories cannot serve as primary teachers for K-12 students, activities that more appropriately belong in the teacher category. Follow-up reviews since 2012 have shown that in some instances, Chinese exchange visitors continued to teach at K-12 schools, As a result, the Office of Private Sector Exchange has further focused its monitoring efforts and taken steps to improve compliance. In November 2017, the office wrote to the nearly 1,000 college and university sponsors, reminding them of the 2012 guidance directive. We have conducted meet and greets with 25 academic program sponsors affiliated with Confucius Institutes and carried out 5 more targeted field site reviews and electronic site reviews. We have scheduled 4 field site reviews for 2019 and will conduct additional electronic reviews. This effort has prioritized institutions where the potential for category confusion appears to be the greatest. 2 of the previous field site reviews and 2 of the electronic reviews resulted in the issuance of letters of concern to the sponsors, documenting areas of regulatory vulnerability and encouraging them to modify their programs to achieve and maintain regulatory compliance. Where K-12 teaching associated with Confucius Institutes was problematic, these university sponsors have since ceased those activities based on our outreach to them. In 2 cases, the Office of Private Sector Exchange worked closely with the Bureau of Consular Affairs, which revoked the visas of exchange visitors who had entered the United States to teach, but not through a sponsor properly designated in the teacher category. The Department of State takes seriously its oversight responsibility of the exchange visitor program and its obligation to monitor designated sponsors and exchange visitors for possible violations of the regulations. We continue to refine our processes to improve regulatory compliance of all designated sponsors, including those who work with Confucius Institutes. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your attention to the critical issue of Chinese interference in U.S. education. The Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs stands ready to cooperate with your ongoing review of this matter. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gold. Dr. Zais.
Chairman Portman, Ranking Member Carper, Senator Hassan, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. As a retired Army Brigadier General and former college president and former Chief of War Plans in the Pentagon, I understand the importance of ensuring that our colleges and universities remain free from malign foreign influence. These concerns surfaced about 30 years ago, and consequently, in 1986, Congress amended the Higher Education Act of 1965 to require institutions to disclose gifts from and contracts with foreign sources. In your letter of instruction and invitation, you noted your intent to examine the Confucius Institutes and the impact of the Chinese government on U.S. education system. You asked me to address foreign gift reporting, and I'm pleased to respond on both issues. Before addressing the Confucius Institutes, I'll provide information on the foreign gift and contract disclosure requirements. The law requires that 2-year and 4-year degree-granting institutions disclose gifts from and contracts with a foreign source in the amount of $250,000 or more in 1 year. Also, any institution owned by or controlled by a foreign source must disclose this information. Since these requirements have been in place, the Department has issued 2 Dear Colleague letters, one in 1995 and one in 2004, to clarify these issues and provide instructions for submitting reports. These requirements are also included in the Federal Student Aid Handbook. There are approximately 3,700 institutions in the United States that are covered by these requirements. Most recently, fewer than 3% of those institutions reported receiving foreign gifts in excess of $250,000 from a single source or country. There are limitations to the reports since the data are self-reported. Some colleges and universities have independent but affiliated nonprofit research, endowment, and alumni foundations which deliver contracts and gifts. It's unclear which schools report foreign gifts that are channeled through these foundations, since the statute does not reference them. To collect the required information, the Department uses the same electronic system that schools use to apply for federal student aid. The system reminds and prompts institutions to provide the required information. Since 2012, the department has made these reports available on the federal student aid websites in the interest of transparency. The information is updated twice a year. During the most recent school year, 91 institutions reported receiving gifts of over $1.3 billion in gifts and contracts from sources in 105 countries. China ranked first in the amount with about $222 million in gifts and contracts. This constituted about 17% of the total. Regarding the impact of the Chinese government and Confucius Institutes on higher education, we recognize this is a concern. As you know, Confucius Institutes are partnerships between the Chinese government and U.S. colleges and universities, each of which has their own agreement. Recently, as you know, a number of these institutions have terminated their agreements. We fully understand and share your concern about the need to keep malign foreign interests from compromising the academic integrity of American colleges and universities while respecting the importance of institutional autonomy and academic freedom. As your subcommittee reviews the issues presented by the Confucius Institutes, the Chinese government, and foreign gifts and contracts to our colleges and universities, the department stands ready to work with you on the way forward. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Zais, and thanks to all our witnesses, and we look forward to a dialogue. I'll be here for the entire hearing, and I see some of my colleagues have arrived and have conflicts, so I'm going to delay my questions until they have a chance. I'll first turn to Senator Carper.
Let me yield to Senator Hassan if you'd like to go first. I'm going to be here for the duration.
And I think I'm yielding to Senator Peters.
All right. Yeah, in that case, I'm not going to yield to Senator Hassan. Because I don't like this guy. All right, happy to yield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member. Thank you, and Senator Hassan, thank you so much. I certainly want to thank Chairman for hosting this very important hearing on the impact on our nation's education system that the Chinese may be having, and thank our witnesses for being here today. This hearing is certainly consistent with our bipartisan work in the committee, and particularly as the principal oversight committee for the U.S. Senate, and how seriously all of us take the oversight function. And so in that vein, I actually have a question outside of the scope of this hearing, but one that's incredibly important for the oversight of the administration, and that's to Deputy Secretary, is it Zais? Am I pronouncing? Zais. Deputy Secretary Zais, on January 3rd, 2019, the Department of Education Acting Inspector General Sandra Bruce received a letter from you urging her to, and I quote, reconsider any plan that her office might have to review a Department of Education decision. I think the letter has just been handed to you. Is that your signature at the bottom of the letter?
Yes, sir, it is.
Deputy Secretary, did Secretary DeVos or her designee or any employee of the White House direct you to send that letter?
No, Senator, they did not.
So you did that on your own?
I worked with the staff and the chief of staff in composing that letter.
As you're aware, the subject of the Education Department decision being reviewed by the Acting Inspector General was the Accrediting Council for Independent Colleges and Schools, ACICS. It's a major accreditor for for-profit colleges. Did you, Secretary DeVos, or a designee communicate with ACICS or anyone acting on their behalf regarding the IG investigation?
We did not.
As mentioned, your letter was sent on January 3rd. On January 31st, Ms. Bruce was notified that she was being replaced as Acting Inspector General by the Department's General Counsel, a decision that was later reversed under pressure. The Department has confirmed that decision to replace Ms. Bruce was initially recommended by the Department, not the White House. Did you participate in conversations with Secretary DeVos or her designee or with any White House employee regarding the designation of a new Acting Inspector General?
I did not.
Earlier this week, my colleagues on the education committees received a response from the department to an oversight letter on this topic. Unfortunately, the department's response was wholly inadequate and does not address the vast majority of our questions, concerns, and requests for the documentation. The department's response cites, and I quote, executive branch confidentiality interest as a reason not to produce the requested documentation. My question to you, has the President invoked executive privilege?
Not to my knowledge, Senator.
Has the department performed a document search of records that would be responsive to the request of my education committee colleagues or the follow-up letter from February 19th that was sent from the Democratic leadership of all House and Senate education and oversight committees, including this full committee?
Senator, I do not know, but I certainly will investigate.
And has the department issued a preservation order to ensure that documents responsive to our request will not be destroyed?
I can assure you that documents will not be destroyed that are relevant.
And just my final point, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Can I have your commitment that my colleagues and I will receive a full and complete response to our letters from February 1st and February 19th, no later than March 5th?
Senator, we will work to expedite response to your inquiries.
Well, I appreciate your answers. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Okay, I plan to reclaim my time unless my colleagues are going to ask questions about this hearing.
I'm happy not to speak yet, but I just want to say that's probably the most succinct series of responses I've heard in 18 years.
Yeah, very succinct, and that was good. But are we going to talk about the focus of our 18-month investigation? If not, I'll ask some questions about that.
I certainly have questions about the report. I certainly, as a member of the Help Committee, also have the same concerns that Senator Peters raised. And so I think, as always, we respect each other's use of our time. I certainly
Exactly, but I just want to be sure we have the opportunity to ask some questions.
Of course, and I have
today.
questions prepared for that, but I also just want to indicate that I share the concerns that Senator Peters just raised.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you, Senator Portman and Ranking Member Carper, for your continued attention to the issue of foreign influence in the United States education system. And thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today, for your service and for your appearance and for your very informative testimony. I want to start with a question to you, Mr. Zais, and to Mr. Douglas. It is clear that U.S. schools have challenges with establishing and maintaining Confucius institutes. For example, faculty at some schools have raised concerns that Hanban, the Office of Chinese Language Council International, is able to exert influence over the development of curriculum or program requirements related to Chinese studies at U.S. schools. I think I speak for all of us in saying that the Chinese Communist Party cannot have an unchecked voice or promote a select agenda in the United States as part of a larger propaganda or government-directed national campaign. To address some of these concerns, some schools have developed their own safeguards against influence on academic affairs through faculty-led initiatives. For example, the University of New Hampshire has taken steps to ensure that all curriculum and programs are developed solely by its own faculty, hired a tenured track faculty member to direct Chinese studies programs, and put in place processes for the review and approval of Confucius Institute's programs and course material by an academic oversight committee and the College of Liberal Arts. So let's start with Mr. Zais. In addition to some of the recommendations in the subcommittee report that highlight the need for additional transparency, is there a role for the Department of Education to support schools that wish to continue to implement these kinds of safeguards to help ensure the integrity of these programs?
Senator, we're always concerned with institutional autonomy and academic freedom and any threats to academic freedom. We will work with schools at their requests to help guarantee that, and if they request support in crafting appropriate agreements, we would be willing to provide that support.
Do you think it's appropriate, though, for the department to reach out? Because now that this report has been issued and there have been some concerns about the behavior of some of these institutes on some campuses, it may be incumbent on the department to do the kind of outreach to schools that may not be aware of this report or may not be aware of some of the activities that some of the Confucius Institutes and their members have engaged in.
we're willing to work with the committee to make all of our Hanban institutions, schools, and sponsors aware of the results of these investigations and reports.
Okay. Let me ask Mr. Douglas, I would like to understand how the Department of State can engage Chinese government representatives in ensuring that Confucius Institute contracts are developed in consultation with U.S. entities and are transparent.
Okay, let me say, my responsibilities start at the water's edge and go out.
Okay.
Rather than in. And so, as I mentioned in my remarks, when we are harassed overseas, we regularly bring this up with the Chinese authorities and expect reciprocity. But on the agreements that they have with the universities, we do not interfere with that.
So, Ms. Galt, is that your realm?
Senator, I'd be happy to answer that. The State Department, as I mentioned in my testimony, does not have authority over Confucius Institutes per se, because they are not designated sponsors to host international visitors to the United States.
So between the Department of Education and the Department of State, how are we going to get to a place where we are following some of the recommendations of this report? Because my colleagues have mentioned, and you each shared today, recommendations that certain components of the contract should be eliminated, including the components that make the contracts confidential. So how or who among and in the executive branch is going to say to the Chinese government, keeping these contracts confidential is not acceptable?
I would just say, as a department, we are involved in a larger discussion with U.S. universities about the importance of transparency, about the importance of protection of academic freedom. So that conversation is ongoing, and we are involved in that conversation.
I think what I'd like to suggest is that we be more involved. I think there has to be a way to let the Chinese government know that if they have an interest in having these institutes on our college campuses, that their contracts have to be transparent, that they can't keep the terms of those contracts confidential. And I would look forward to working with all of you to figure out how we can make that happen.
We'd welcome the opportunity to discuss that further.
Okay, and just, I thank you for that. I do want to get back, and I respect the chair's interest in making sure we focus on the report, which is a very important report, and something that, again, I think we all need to continue to work to implement the recommendations of. But I did just want to go back, Mr. Zais, to follow up on what I think I heard was a commitment from you and the department to Senator Peters. I am on the HELP committee. I have been on letters to the department to try to understand why the CIS entity was re-credentialed. I've expressed concerns about the department's citations, about recommendations for this entity that weren't true. And so I want to make sure that we do, in fact, get a response, a much more adequate response than the letter we got from Mr. Oppenheim on February 25th to our letters about this. So again, can I have your commitment that the department will provide a full and complete response to the letters sent on February 1st and 19th, and can you do it no later than March 5th?
Senator, we will work to expedite a response.
Okay. And please just note also for the record that this letter cites something called the executive branch confidentiality interest, and I am unaware of such an interest that would allow the department to fail to respond to a congressional inquiry. Thank you.
Senator Carper.
I would just say to our new member, fairly new member of our committee, sometimes the chairman and I will yield to other folks on our committee before we ask questions if they have other things they need to be doing, and I'd be happy to yield to you if you'd like.
I thank the ranking member for yielding, and also the chairman for the two of you for bringing together this group and opening a discussion on something that I think is quite important, and appreciate the various people coming today and testifying and providing information and perspective. I think it's pretty clear that we and China have very different views on a whole host of very important topics. And I was just writing down a list here, but everything from how we deal and welcome minorities in our civilization, how we believe about diversity, what we think about single-party rule, how we would deal with Taiwan, for instance. Our perspective on censorship is very different. Our perspective on human rights is very, very different. The rule of law in our nation and their nation is very different. The South China Sea is an area of great conflict. The list goes on and on. We have a number of things that are very different between the perspectives of a free people in the United States of America and the leadership of China. And so I wonder whether these Confucius Institutes are part of an influence campaign by the Chinese government to shape attitudes in the minds of the American children, the coming generations, as to those kinds of differences. Is this really a propaganda effort, a mind-shaping effort of our young people being carried out through the auspices of these Confucius Institutes? So I'd ask for your perspective and whether you believe that's the case.
I would say generally, Senator, first of all, thank you for the question. I would say generally the State Department supports international educational exchange. We support Americans learning critical languages. As you may know, the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, thanks to congressional support, conducts a number of programs to teach Americans languages critical to our national security, including Mandarin Chinese. We have the Gilman Fellowship for Young Americans, and we also have the National Security Language Initiative, which supports both high school and college students to go overseas and study languages critical to the United States national security.
That makes all the sense in the world, to study other languages and to learn about other cultures. But the question I have is whether the Chinese government is selecting individuals, funding for individuals into our educational institutions with the intent not just of letting us learn an important global language, but also and a different culture, but also to gain a perspective on a host of issues where they and we have different points of view, whether this is in effect an influence campaign, whether it's being financed as an influence campaign to shape public opinions of our young people.
Thank you for the question. I would say that in the course of the work that we did looking at Confucius Institutes, the one thing that really popped out for us was the variety of activities that they do. You know, you've certainly heard about the language training, and I think as Ranking Member Carper talked about in his statement, there are a variety of other cultural events that they focus on, holiday celebrations, cooking events, things like that. We didn't really focus on questions that you were focused on there, but I think that it's notable, the variety of activities that they perform.
Yeah, I'm not sensing anyone jumping to the bait on that, and perhaps we don't have information about that. But I guess that's the question in my mind, which is, I would welcome the chance to learn about a foreign language, the culture of another people, but it would be a very different matter to have people coming in from another nation that has such dramatically different perspectives than we do in our country. If their intent in coming to our country is to inculcate those attitudes and views among our young people. And I would hope that there's a way for us to be able to determine whether that's occurring and the extent to which it's occurring, and to provide, if it is occurring, to provide a warning to educational institutions about the potential concern that would obviously be attached to something of that nature. You've also spoken about reciprocity and the opportunity for us to be able to share our culture and language in their nation. That's apparently been very difficult to obtain, the kind of reciprocity that we had hoped, and I would anticipate that the degree to which we are able to welcome and provide visas and so forth to those that want to become part of Confucius Institutes here would be gauged to a certain degree to the kind of welcome we receive there. And wonder whether we are taking action to make sure that there is a, if you will, reciprocity here with the degree of welcome that we have there. Is that the case, or is there more to be done there?
Because I'm here to speak about what we do in China, when we are harassed or when things are blocked or upset, we regularly protest to the Chinese government that we expect the same treatment here that we give to your embassy in the United States. And so we regularly make those protests. How successful they are, that's another matter, but we do regularly approach them. I've done it myself, actually, when I've been visiting there, and make it very clear that we expect that.
Yeah, and that is, I think, wise and effective. I would also suggest that in some respects we might respond in the same way with their requests that they respond to ours, which it's one thing to protest when they do things that we don't approve of. It's another thing to say, well, if you're going to do that to people that we're trying to encourage to be part of your system, why then we're going to do the same to yours. And that seems to concentrate the mind more than protest. Happy to return the time back to the ranking member or the chairman. I think my time is up.
Thank you. I really appreciate your comments, Senator Romney, and I think you are hitting the nail on the head. And I think the question is whether this Confucius Institute funding and the activities that they engage in is something that is consistent with our traditions here. And what we found in our report, of course, is that it is not. And the GAO found the same thing in their reporting. And I think Mr. Douglas might be a little more forthcoming in a moment when he talks about how we're treated over there, because you're absolutely right. We don't have reciprocity there. And this is why the State Department has actually shut down our program there, because they can't operate. And so there is not reciprocity. And Mr. Douglas has been good about that in his opening statement. We're going to ask him some more questions about it. But let's, so I appreciate your questions, but also your insights, and I think they're accurate. Mr. Baer, thank you for working with us, and in fact, issuing your report last night in conjunction with ours. You did a separate investigation. Yours was a little different focus, as you indicated. But I think we both showed that there's a lack of transparency at these U.S.-based Confucius Institutes that does implicate academic freedom, among other things. You have talked about the level of control and the lack of transparency. For example, officials told the subcommittee that the Confucius Institutes were not the place to discuss topics like the independence of Taiwan or the Tiananmen Square massacre. Your report said, for example, that researchers told you that a Confucius Institute could choose to avoid hosting events on certain topics elsewhere on campus, such as Taiwan, government of Tibet, or Tiananmen Square massacre, so as not to offend its Chinese partners, end quote. Can you elaborate on that self-censorship?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think that's an important topic, and it's one of the central issues that we dealt with in our report. Let me start with the issue of transparency. I think, as I talked about in my opening statement, one of the notable things about the agreements that we got copies of between the U.S. university and their Chinese partner was whether those agreements were going to be able to be publicly available. And what we found was that only 42 of the 90 contained specific clauses making them confidential or in some way limiting the public release of those documents. And so when we talked to a variety of stakeholders and faculty and administrators, a number of them raised that issue. Whether it was real or apparent, it creates, at a minimum, concern about what's in those agreements. And so a number of universities that we spoke to were willing to share those agreements with us, and I think a number of the stakeholders think that that's a really important first step.
Yeah. Mr. Baer, let me take you to Exhibit 1, just because you made the point about these contracts. And if you look in your binder, it's in front of you, and I'll, without objection, enter Exhibit 1 into the record today. There are some concerning provisions. For instance, the contract states, as you'll see there, that the Chinese instructor, quote, should conscientiously safeguard national interests. Again, these are Chinese instructors who are here on a visa in the United States. The contract terminates if the Chinese instructors violate Chinese laws. So they're subject to Chinese laws here in America. Or, quote, engages in activities detrimental to national interests, end quote. So this is on a college campus where we pride academic freedom, and these are the restrictions placed on that Confucius Institute instructor. We weren't able to find many contracts because, as you say, they're hard to find, and some are confidential. This one might have been, but we were able to obtain it. Your report also found that some school officials expressed concerns that the Confucius Institute hiring process didn't follow their own hiring processes for teachers at the university. In fact, your report found that some schools did not have, as I quote from your report, full control over selecting its teachers. Why is it concerning that U.S. schools have foreign teachers, one, signing these contracts with contract law to be enforced by Chinese law, and then second, that conscientiously safeguarding the national interest is one of the requirements, and they can be terminated if they engage in activities detrimental to national interests, in addition to the fact that these schools aren't following their normal hiring procedures in order to hire these individuals, some of whom do teach credit courses. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, let me try to the best of my ability to talk about what we heard during the course of our review, and you very appropriately point out some of the concerns that frankly were expressed to us as well about the hiring process for these teachers. There, I'll say we heard a mix of views. We certainly talked to a number of universities that either had chosen to close their Confucius Institute or had considered opening a Confucius Institute but had made a decision not to. One of the reasons was that they didn't feel like they had full control over the hiring process, and that was a deal breaker for them. And so they made a decision that they thought was in the best interest of their university. Some of the Confucius Institutes that we visited that were open during the course of our review, that though they may have had some concerns, felt that they had the final decision-making authority of who they would hire, and they were choosing from a set of applicants. They were comfortable with that decision. So the opinions really differed on that issue.
On research, quickly, your report found that Confucius Institutes also sponsor Chinese-related research projects for U.S. students and U.S. professors, and those proposals had to be approved by the Chinese government first. You said that several school officials expressed concern or uncertainty about whether a Confucius Institute would sponsor a research project on a, quote, topic that could include criticism of China, end quote. So again, going to academic freedom and research, that certainly is not consistent, as Senator Romney was talking about, with our traditions here. Mr. Douglas, so much to talk about in terms of the China part of this. Let me just ask you something sort of straightforward here. Can you describe to us what reciprocity means in international relations? Quickly.
I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what the legal term is, but I assume
you're a diplomat.
Right. If one side does something, the other side could do it too.
Yeah. So the State Department has found that the Chinese government essentially shut down one state program known as the American Cultural Centers, or the ACC program. We talked about this earlier. And let me just ask you a couple questions about the State Department and your relationship with ACC programs as compared to what we talked about in terms of the Chinese relationship with the Confucius Institutes. Do State Department contracts with the ACC programs have a clause that says that the schools must conscientiously safeguard U.S. interests?
No.
Do you vet or screen U.S. professors for the ACC program?
No.
Does the State Department require that they approve every ACC event?
No.
Does State Department maintain veto power over proposed speakers or lecture topics at ACCs?
No.
Does State Department always provide U.S. schools with pre-approved textbooks or materials for an ACC?
No.
Does the State Department grant agreements with U.S. schools that have confidentiality or non-disclosure provisions, as we talked about?
Not that I know of, no.
So to summarize, the State Department does not maintain control over teachers, topics, or speakers at an ACC in China?
That's exactly right.
Okay. That doesn't sound like reciprocity, the way you described it.
Yeah, what we're dealing this is how we deal with in the American system with American values of when we go to overseas. And that's really where, in public diplomacy, what we focus on is what we do overseas. And that's how we operate worldwide.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. We talked about the 100 Confucius Institutes at college campuses and about 500 in K through 12. How many American cultural centers is the State Department funding in China today?
3, and their holdovers, their funding will run out. It's just the remains of what funds they have, but the others have been closed down. We stopped the funding.
So after the summer, how many will there be in China?
Go down to 0.
0. Okay, thank you. I've exceeded my time, but I'm going to come back later with more questions.
Sure.
Senator Carper.
I'm sitting here thinking about a couple of our former colleagues. One is a guy named Biden, who served here for, I guess, part of 7 terms. And it was the senior Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee for many of those years, chairman for many years. He has a lot of sayings, and he and I served together in a lot of capacities, and I've heard them all. One of my favorite Joe Biden's was, all diplomacy is personal. I say all diplomacy is personal. He also said that about all politics is personal. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I was mentioning to our chairman, as an aside, earlier in the hearing, that there was once a rising Chinese official who came to the United States, and he's interested in learning more about agriculture. And they wanted to go to our breadbasket in our heartland, and they ended up in a couple of states. One of them, I think, was Iowa. And he was hosted by the governor there. And they kind of hit it off. Had a good visit. I learned a lot. And later on, the governor would lead a trade mission to China, and they would cross paths again. The Chinese official is a guy whose last name is Xi. And the American governor is a guy whose last name is Branstad, now our Chinese ambassador. And I think about them and their, I guess, friendship over all these years. And I think about what Joe said about the diplomacy being personal. We focus, we had our caucus retreats last month. Democrats had their caucus retreats, and Republicans had theirs. We never do them together. We almost never eat together either. And we focus at our retreats on things that divide us. I guess I've talked to some of my Republican colleagues about their retreat, my moles, and they said they spent a fair amount of time focusing on what divides us as well. And I think one of the things that's important in our relationship with China is a huge country, huge trading partner, and they're going to be around for a long time. Hopefully, we will too. And we got to figure out how to get along with them. Having said that, I don't like being taken advantage of. And I should ask the audience: anybody out there like being taken advantage of? None of us do. And so, for me, sort of the challenge is how do we make sure we're not going to be taken advantage of as a nation? Have our stature diminished, our strength diminished by these guys and gals, and at the same time do what we can to find areas of agreement. One of our colleagues is a guy named Enzi here from Gillette, Wyoming, wonderful guy, Republican, conservative. He and Ted Kennedy used to have a great relationship when they were the seniors. The committees, one of the committees that Senator Romney's on, the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, got a huge amount done. I once asked Enzi, I said, how do you guys work so well together? And he said, we focus on the 80-20 rule, 80-20 rule. I said, what's that? He said, we focus on 80% of what we agree on. We set aside the 24% where we don't agree, and we get a lot done as a result. So I think it's important for us to use a similar kind of rule with the Chinese, focus on the areas where we agree, set aside some areas where we don't agree, and that's probably not a bad recipe. That doesn't mean we always agree when they try to use cybersecurity to steal our trade secrets, to steal our military secrets. It doesn't mean we should agree with them when they do unfair things on the trade side. So, but having said that, it's important we do find ways to agree. Let me ask you a question, Hanson. I think Senator Romney asked a couple of really insightful questions. On the one hand, we want to be able to work with these folks where we can. On the other hand, we want to make sure we're not taken advantage of. I ask each of you, what should we do in response to the kind of behavior that we see demonstrated by them and their reluctance or refusal to allow us to have reciprocity in their countries? What should we do? And I think I'll start with a fellow my staff said, General, he said, your name rhymes with nice, and I found it doesn't. It rhymes with mace. And there you go, face, rhymes with face. Take a shot at that question. Not a real long answer, but just kind of you had a great series of answers earlier. Just take it.
Senator, if you know how to get reciprocity while still maintaining the lines of communication between our two societies, I don't know how to do that. I think we understand that everything in Communist China is run by the government, all of their education system and everything. So I don't know how you take politics out of interaction with that regime, that government.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the, before I turn to Ambassador Galt, right? I turn to Ambassador Galt. I mentioned to our chairman and to you as well. I just mentioned to our colleagues, I ran into Max Baucus yesterday, former colleague, immediate past the ambassador to China. And I'm very much interested in asking him. I just wish I had brought him here, plunk him out in the audience, pull him up to the table and say, well, what do you think, Max? But I would like to pick his brain, and I'd actually like to pick the brain of our current ambassador there, Terry Branstad, with whom we served. I don't know, did you serve with him as governor? He was as governor for life, and then he became ambassador, maybe for life, we'll see. But same question. We know we need to figure out how to get along with these people. We don't want to be taken advantage of. We realize that cultural exchanges can actually be very helpful. They worked in a lot of other places. And, where's the, I guess I'm looking for the balance, the right balance here. How do we do this? And you speak how many different languages? 6, 7? Just use English for me.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to go a little bit off script here to answer your question.
I've gone off script too, so you should be able to.
I'm going to follow your lead. I think this is an essential question. I think it is a tough one to achieve that balance. So I'd like to speak from my professional experience as a career diplomat.
You can even speak from your heart.
15 years of my career in China, engaged in public diplomacy work, engaged in trying to explain the United States to Chinese. And I have found that I think 2 elements of this, of a solution are essential, and we need to just keep at them. The first element is we need to call the Chinese out when they behave badly. Whether it's demarching on a canceled speech or an edited set of remarks or not allowing us to go to university campuses, I think we need to keep calling them out. And we can't do that enough, in my view. The second thing I think we need to do...
Who is the we? We should be, I think you're right, but who is the we? And we should be calling them out.
We, the State Department, that's what we do as diplomats stationed in Mission China. And here in Washington, we can amplify that message with Chinese diplomats posted here in the United States.
And occasionally our president talks to their leaders as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. We can do this at all levels of our government.
And we have congressional delegations that go over there from time to time.
Yes. And we have U.S. universities who engage, and they can share those messages from their own perspective.
So it may be the idea of a consistent message from us. Okay.
Yes. The second thing I think we need to do is continue to share American values and American best practices with young Chinese, with the next generation of Chinese. The Chinese students represent the largest number of international students in the United States, so we know there is continued interest in the high-quality American education and the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit that we have in the United States. There is value in the academic freedom and the world-class research that American universities offer. And I have to believe that that Chinese leader who visited Muscatine, Iowa, and the other Chinese who visit the United States learn something about our system, and that will make a difference in the long run. That is my public diplomacy heart speaking, and I think those are 2 elements of a possible solution, and I thank you again for the question.
No, you bet. I said earlier, Mr. Chairman, I know my time's expired. I'm going to ask, can I have just 2 more minutes for a response, please, if you don't mind? I said earlier that before other colleagues arrived that General Zais had a great series of responses, short answers, and I would say your response, you just hit a home run. And with maybe a couple of runners on base, so thank you for that. All right, Mr. Douglas, I'm sorry you have to follow that, but go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, let me say everything Ambassador Galt said. I was going to say in various ways the same thing.
So you would say, I'm Walter Douglas and I approve this message?
That's good enough for me.
Good.
But I've been involved with public diplomacy since 1986. I joined USIA, and then that's moved on. I've served in a number of various places. And what you do see is that the engagement we have with public diplomacy does tend to have a long-term impact. And we see leaders all over the world who've gone on our programs 30 years later, maybe 20 years later, you get the impact from that. We try to track how many of our world's leaders and world cabinet members and those types have been on our programs, and we usually come up with a 20-25% number. Ambassador told me that a recent change of government in her country, in the new cabinet that came in, 14 of the cabinet members had been in one of our programs somewhere. Okay. And it gave us an automatic dialogue with those people and friendliness. So, and we see that in China. Ambassador Galt mentioned the tremendous number of students who come here. One of our programs that's very successful there is Education USA. We talk about, we prepare them, we give student advising, talk about preparing for coming to the United States. They have an impact when they come back with a much broader view of the United States. I'd say that across the board with all of our exchange programs. These do have an impact in the long term. And they do change attitudes. So we have such an attractive society. People want to come here. That's a strategic advantage we have. It's our soft power is awesome throughout the world. And as a public diplomacy officer, I really have seen the impact over the time. The more we can expose people to the United States, the better off the long-term result is.
That's great. I'm way over my time, Mr. Baer. I'm not going to ask you to, as a rep from GA, you guys do great work. We love what you do and value it very much. Thank you all. That was terrific. Thank you. Shei Shei. Zhangqi Sci-Fi. That means have a prosperous new year in this year of the boar, which just began recently. All the best.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Senator Hawley if he has some questions and to welcome you to the subcommittee as well as Senator Romney. As you can see, we're kind of freewheeling here. But we also do good nonpartisan work here. It's ended up with some significant legislation in addition to our oversight responsibilities, and we're pleased to have both of you on the subcommittee. Senator Hawley.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. It's a privilege to be here and to be part of the subcommittee. Let me come back to the public diplomacy angle. And Mr. Douglas, I want to start with you. In your prepared testimony, you shared a lot of information, good information, about the extent of Chinese government interference and disruption with our public diplomacy efforts, beyond even the experience of the American Cultural Center programs. You noted, for example, the Chinese government efforts to disrupt some of our outreach from our embassy in Beijing, social media, et cetera. I want to ask you about Chinese government disruptions of our public diplomacy efforts outside of China, and in particular, perhaps the 68 countries that China considers part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm just wondering, recognizing, of course, that China's footprint differs across those countries, have you noticed explicit cases, or are you aware of explicit cases of Chinese government interference, interruptions of U.S. public diplomacy efforts in those places? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's like that. It's generally more there's a competitive space out there that we both go and fill. And we have our public diplomacy efforts. They have theirs. I think because our product is better to sell, and that is, in a sense, we have America, the United States, and all its values. Our programs tend to be more popular. We get large attendance. We don't have to force anyone to do anything about it. So while we see they have some public diplomacy programs, I would not say they're as effective. I also note that we launched our first ever report of Chinese public diplomacy. It was presented in Singapore in June of 2018, in which it underscored what their efforts are, how much they tied them into their economic policies. But we also found that we needed to know more, so we have actually come with round 2 of that. And we've got we've got our second report that'll be coming out in a few months, which looks into more aspects of what Chinese public diplomacy is in the East Asian Pacific region. So for us, it's really helpful to have a better understanding of what they do. Yes, they're out there, but I don't think that because what they ultimately have to share with other countries, I don't think it's nearly has the impact that we have.
Tell us a little bit about some of the ways that the Chinese government attempts to interfere with our public diplomacy efforts, apart from, in addition to, our American Cultural Center programs. Yeah.
Well, we mentioned, for example, they harassing some of our visitors for our international visitors program, 20%. I remember at one point there was even one of the participants was at the airport and was pulled back. And so it can go to this very haphazard, application. I think in the absence of a rule of law, it's unclear when and why, how they will do that, and it's something we live with. But we still think that for the other percents that get through, which are greater, these programs are very worth it. We see the censorship on our social media platforms. We see censorship in general of everything we do. We will. They might take an op-ed and hack it to pieces, keep some of it, let others be printed, other parts of it be printed. So all along the line, you don't really know what's going to happen. There's a very haphazard, unpredictable application of whatever rules and regulations they have. So we still just have to work with it. It's one of the difficulties of working in that country. But our officers are still dedicated to doing it. I should note that I mentioned Chinese speaking, as my colleague over here, and that's a very effective tool for us, that we have our officers who can be out there interacting not just with, say, Chinese government officials. Public diplomacy, we tend not to do that, but we can cover a much broader range of opinion leaders, rising leaders, and those types because of our officers.
And tell us a little bit about some of the measures that we have taken. You talk about their efforts at disruption, some of which you say we just have to live with, we press on. But are there measures that we are taking to adapt, to respond, to curtail their interference, or just to try and get around their interference with our public diplomacy efforts?
I think what we look at as, and I could say this is true everywhere we go, and I've been served in, I don't know, 9 or 10 countries now, is that we have this toolkit of public diplomacy tools, and different ones are appropriate for different countries. And when my last overseas posting was India, open democratic country, you can pretty much do anything you want there. We never got no, we never had any office say you couldn't do this, we never had anybody censored for what they've done. But when you go to other countries, you have to look at what part of that toolkit is most appropriate, where can you get the biggest bang for the buck. And so our public affairs officers then choose from that what works and then actually see what works. I mentioned Education USA because we know that the Chinese are very interested in studying the United States. It's something that they very much welcome, as any college advising they have, education advising even below college. So what we try to do is promote those things where we know we can have a lot more success.
Yeah, thank you. In my time remaining, I just want to come back to this, the broad topic of these Confucius Institutes, which I understand we've been discussing quite a lot. I have to say that reading the report, looking at the spread of these institutes, the degree of government control is really, really shocking, I think. And I think that the American public would be shocked and will be shocked to learn about exactly what is going on these college campuses. I'm not sure to whom to direct this question, so let me just throw it out there and whomever. Can you just talk about broadly? I think one question that people will have when they hear about this is, well, why would an American college campus ever allow something like this to be on there? Why would they ever think this is a good idea? Why is that? Do any of you want to address that? I mean, how does it happen that we find ourselves in this circumstance to begin with? Yeah, Mr. Bear.
I'd be happy to start with that. We visited a number of colleges and university campuses that host Confucius Institutes, and they had a variety of reasons. Some of them were interested in attracting more Chinese students, and so they thought that having a Confucius Institute might provide them some entree to get a greater number of Chinese students. And as you've heard from others, about a third of the foreign students studying in the United States are from China, and so they viewed that as very attractive. It also was an opportunity for them perhaps to have programs that they wouldn't otherwise be able to fund related to, let's say, Chinese language. And so I think those were a couple of the key things that they mentioned for us.
How big of a component is funding, do you think, the availability of funds for programs that the university might itself otherwise have to spend its own budget on?
I'd say the answer varies significantly by university. There are some very large universities which have a significant amount of funding available, and for them it's going to be less important. But for some of the smaller universities that might not otherwise be able to have access to those, it could be a more significant pull for them.
Okay, I just note that the Chinese funds, the Chinese government has invested over $158 million in funds over just this past decade, which is really staggering, I think, and quite significant. Thank you all for being here. I see that my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Romney, follow-up questions?
I just make one additional thought, which is it's stunning to me that they have effectively closed down our cultural centers in China. We're going to be at 0 by the end of the year, and yet they have 100 here. And we say, gosh, we're going to protest and we're going to express how unhappy we are with them doing this. But it's not so much a question as a comment, which is, why are we not saying it's going to be harder for you to get visas for people to come here to become part of your Confucius centers? It's like, because I think the Chinese, like other people like myself respond to action. And when they're able to keep adding more and more Confucius centers and bringing in people, and in many cases inculcating people with values that we would find foreign and inappropriate, that we continue to allow that without taking reciprocal action and saying, you know, you don't have our centers, you're not going to have your centers. That would be part one. And then part two, I would think it would be simply unacceptable in our country to have a faculty member on a university campus that is, or at a K through 12 institution, that is subject to a contract with a foreign government, as opposed to being subject only to the contract and the principles and procedures of the American educational institution. And I think in both those things, we can take action. It's not necessary to have legislation to pursue that action, but I think in both cases we need to take action to assure that these institutions are, one, not part of an influence effort that we would find inappropriate, and two, that the faculty members that are teaching in our institutions are abiding by American principles and the contracts of American institutions, as opposed to the contract of a communist Chinese government. If you have any comment or thought, I'm happy to have you have that opportunity. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this.
I'd like to comment on that.
Please.
No, I mean, I think, again, you're insightful and making good points. I would say two things. One, threatening to discontinue the programs here might be very effective to open up what you have experienced in China, as Mr. Douglas has talked about. What we're talking about today, though, in our report, is simply having the transparency that is required under law. I mean, with all due respect, the State Department has visited how many? Two out of the 110 until we started our investigation, now 100 colleges and universities. And you found violations at both, significant violations at both. Yet there haven't been any other site visits. Dr. Zeiss, we know that 33 of the 48, 70% of the U.S. schools that should have reported a contribution from a foreign government of over $250,000 haven't done so. So you have, 70% of the schools are in violation. And yet, you haven't referred a single one to the Department of Justice, which is under law what has to happen. Justice can't prosecute unless you refer. So it's even worse than you're saying, in a sense. We're not near to the point of suggesting that we discontinue, but what we are saying is, unless there is transparency and at least following U.S. law, we ought to discontinue the existing practice, because it's not consistent with traditions and practices, as we've talked about here, in terms of the contracts with these teachers and the lack of academic freedom. But second, it's not even following our own laws, and we're not enforcing our own laws. Finally, I will say, second point is that the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee just a few days ago published a document saying that Confucius Institutes remain a key government policy, and said that China now plans to optimize the spread of Confucius Institutes. Well, I don't blame them. I mean, it seems like it's working pretty well for them if you're the Communist Party in China. We're not sure what optimize means. It might mean a rebranding effort in ways that would intend to seek even more of their interests, national interests, as we talked about in these contracts, and less transparency and less disclosure. But I think this is a serious concern, and I think both of you outlined that well. We want more exchange, of course. We want more engagement. We believe that China ought to be a strategic partner, in addition to being a strategic competitor. And yet, it's got to be on some basis of a level playing field. I made the analogy earlier to our trade policy. It's not a bad analogy here, where I think Senator Romney is absolutely right. I think the way to get the attention of the Chinese government on the trade issue has been to say, well, if you're not going to let our products in and not going to treat our companies fairly, then we're going to have to reciprocate. And what you find is suddenly they come to the table, which is what's happening right now. And our hope is that in the next short period of time, maybe the next few weeks, we'll have some resolution of that. But here, we haven't even enforced our own laws. And so I think we've been able, through our investigation of the last 8 months and through a lot of interviews to be able to obtain enough information to at least be sure that the State Department, which does have a responsibility here in this country, Ambassador Galt, you're not just focused on overseas, and the Department of Education, which does have a responsibility here, ought to, at a minimum, follow the U.S. law that's in place. And I think put out new guidance. The guidance is 14 years old and was put in place when there was one Confucius Institute, as I understand. As it grows, we ought to be sure that these universities and colleges and high schools and middle schools and elementary schools know what the guidance is.
We agree with you, Senator. This is a concern, and we're grateful to you and your committee for shining a light on this issue and bringing it to public attention. And we will look forward to working with you to rectify some of these issues.
Well, thank you. Let me ask you a couple of questions, if I could. With regard to the schools that have not reported, what's your intention with regard to acting on that, and specifically including the Department of Justice by giving them the information?
In the past, every institution that we've called and reminded them of the requirement to report, normally this comes to our attention because they've reported significant gifts in the past and then they failed to report a gift. They've responded appropriately and provided the requested information. We've never had an institution that's just refused to report, which is why we've never referred the case to the Justice Department. But I think what the department needs to do is figure out how to be a little more proactive in getting complete reports from all of the institutions.
Yeah, with all due respect, when 70% of the schools, based on our investigation, maybe we're wrong, but based on our investigation, 70% of the schools are not complying. So I guess you have to make more phone calls if you're saying that's the way to do it, is to be sure that they understand it. Otherwise, a civil action may be brought by the Attorney General at the request of the Secretary of Education. And, you know, if you're finding that people are not complying, even though you're providing guidance, maybe that would, as was indicated earlier with regard to the Chinese government on reciprocity, maybe that would get people's attention.
Yes, Senator.
Would you look briefly at Exhibit 2 in the table in front of you? It's a Dear Colleague letter dated October 4th from the Department of Education to U.S. schools. It provides detail on reporting of gifts, contracts, and relationships. Without objection, I'd like to enter Exhibit 2 into the record. This is about 15 years old. Do you have a plan to issue this updated guidance to U.S. schools regarding the reporting of foreign gifts?
Senator, at the present time, we do not have a plan, but we certainly look forward to exploring how to clarify this guidance document and working with the committee to clarify portions of the statute that are not clear. As I mentioned in my testimony, the issue of affiliated independent foundations through which gifts and contract dollars are routed is not addressed in the statute. We want to clarify that as well.
We'd be delighted to work with you on any clarifications on the statute, but the statute's clear enough to know that you have to report. And so you were pretty forward-leaning earlier in response to some questions on some much more difficult issues. I would think on this one you can give us a yes, which is that you will issue new guidance. The question is when, but you will issue these guidance so we don't have these schools continue to be uncertain about what their responsibilities are.
Absolutely.
That's a yes.
Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Zais. And Ambassador Galt, same question to you, a yes or no question. You found problems with visa use at all of your site visits, huge problems, you know, relative to, I assume, what you expected. You've gone to 2% of the Confucius Institutes. You found 30 visas had to be revoked at just 2 institutions, 30 visas. Do you have a plan to ensure proper visa use at the roughly 98% of Confucius Institutes that you have not visited?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. We take our monitoring role seriously, as I said in my statement, and let me just describe, we have a layered approach to monitoring. So while we have only done 2 site visits to date, of university sponsors that host Confucius Institutes. We have 4 more planned this year. And we have also, regularly engage in what we call meet and greets, which are meetings with sponsors to share information on regulations, to inquire and to explore. Out of those, we would then conduct electronic reviews of the various databases, the Student Exchange Visitor Database, for example, the SEVIS database operated by Department of Homeland Security, and other databases to explore further. So we have a layered approach. Site visits are only the most intensive of our reviews. We have ongoing engagement with our sponsors on across the full range.
Does that ongoing engagement enable you to find out whether they're being properly operated, including the use of visas?
Yes, it allows us to uncover that, and we would then engage in a site visit, as we plan to with 4 more university sponsors that host Confucius Institutes this year.
I would suggest that taking it from 2% to 6% may be a substantial increase, but not nearly adequate if it's the site visit that really is going to enable you to determine whether they're properly operating. So I would hope that today you would tell us that you're going to step up those efforts.
We will certainly look at that. Our investigations to date, we have encouraged in the 2 site visits, both sponsors have rectified their program administration and are now in full compliance. So we think that our methodology makes sense and our record is good, and we will explore further investigations.
Dr. Zais, one thing that I think could be done is just make schools aware of what's going on. I said in the time period of the last 8 months while we conducted this investigation, 10 programs have been terminated. I can't say that it's strictly because of our questions that we asked all 110 schools, now 100 schools, but I think it probably had an influence on them because they frankly weren't aware, I think at the higher levels of the university leadership, what was going on and what some of the concerns are that we've raised today. I think I heard you say earlier that you intend to provide this report to the colleges and universities that are engaged in Confucius Institutes. Is that accurate?
Certainly to the 96 institutions that currently house Confucius Institutes, but we will send clarifying guidance to all of the 3,700 eligible institutions of higher education.
Okay. And with regard to the K through 12 schools, what's your recommendation there? Do you have the ability to also send them guidance and summaries of this report?
I don't know what our role in the monitoring of K through 12 is for Chinese teachers. As state superintendent of education in South Carolina, we had Chinese language native speakers in some of our language immersion schools. They were exchanged. We sent teachers to China to teach.
Talking about the Confucius Institutes. Would you look into that?
Look, we'll check into it and see what we can do. I'm not sure what we can do, Senator.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but the proper communication, I think, is to provide information.
Yes.
Point to those institutions as well. Mr. Douglas, you said earlier that Chinese diplomats here in the United States can speak to whoever they want, and it's true. You know, at our Rotaries in Ohio, we welcome them. We welcome them at our colleges and universities. What's the situation in China with regard to U.S. diplomats and their ability to speak with whatever group they might choose?
It sometimes can work and sometimes can't. You can't guarantee that you'll have access to anybody. And meetings can get canceled at the very last minute, as what happened with Ambassador Branstad in November. So it's unpredictable.
Let me tell you one story we heard during our investigation. It was from a U.S. School official, a dean actually, and this dean told us that she was interviewed for several hours by Chinese police regarding her school's involvement with your ACC program. It was a harrowing experience for her. It was a difficult, emotional, tough experience. Is this something that you believe happens often? And are you concerned about U.S. universities essentially self-censoring in China because of this kind of harassment?
It's a very good question. It's something we talk about a lot. I can't give you an answer because I don't know that we have data that would sort of, prove one way or the other. We hear anecdotally things like what you say, but I can't say that. I don't know how widespread it is. I think maybe people aren't telling us. We're just a handful of us with a lot more American educators over there. So, but it's a very good question. I just don't think I can answer it, definitely.
One U.S. school told us they would never discuss the topic of Tibet or the topic of Taiwan. That's, again, part of our investigation. This was someone who is, again, telling us how they're experiencing the ACC program. Yeah, that sounds like self-censorship, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does.
Do you think that's typical?
I've heard that anecdotally, so I assume it's more than just one person who said that. A number have.
Well, listen, again, I appreciate all of you coming today and your testimony and work on this. I appreciate the commitments that have been made by the Department of Education today and the Department of State to step up what is the first step in this, which is to provide that transparency and information that is required by law. I appreciate GAO's continued oversight of the Confucius Institutes. I know your report isn't the end of your work into this, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. We will now conclude the hearing, and I will tell you that we are always open to more information. So in particular, this record will stay open for 15 days for any additional comments or questions you might have, any follow-up that you all feel is appropriate. And we look forward to continuing to focus on this issue to ensure we can, at a minimum, have the transparency and the reciprocity that we think is required. Thank you all. Hearing is adjourned.
Have a great day. Thanks.